The line between life and death. For centuries, we thought it was absolute. You're here or you're not, conscious or gone. But in November 2023, something happened in neuroscience labs across 3 continents that made every researcher involved go completely silent for reasons they still won't fully explain on the record. Brain scans of patients experiencing near-death episodes began showing identical patterns. Not similar, identical. The same surge of activity in the same regions at the same intervals, as if every dying brain follows a script written somewhere beyond our understanding. And here's what nobody's talking about. The pattern doesn't match normal brain activity. It doesn't match sleep, dreams, or hallucinations. It matches something else entirely. Something that suggests consciousness doesn't end when the body fails. It transforms. If you're the kind of person who needs to know what happens when we die, you need to subscribe right now, because what these scans revealed changes everything we thought we knew about the final moments of human awareness. And this is just the beginning. The first anomaly appeared in 2013 at the University of Michigan. Dr. Jimo Borjajan, a neuroscientist studying end-of-life brain activity, placed electrodes on laboratory rats and induced cardiac arrest while monitoring their neural patterns. What she expected was a gradual decline. Neurons firing slower and slower until finally nothing. What she got instead made her call her entire team into the lab at 2 in the morning. The rats' brains didn't slow down. They exploded with activity. 30 seconds after the heart stopped, the brain lit up with electrical patterns more intense, more organized, more coherent than anything recorded during normal waking life. Gamma waves, the highest frequency brain activity associated with peak consciousness, surged to levels never seen in living, healthy animals. It lasted for nearly 60 seconds after clinical death. Every rat showed the same pattern. Same timing, same intensity. Same regions activating in perfect sequence. Dr. Borjajan published her findings in 2013. The paper was cautious, measured, scientific, but colleagues who spoke to her privately said she was shaken. She kept asking the same question. If the brain becomes more active after death, what is it doing? What is it experiencing? The scientific community largely ignored it. Animal studies, they said, doesn't prove anything about human consciousness, but Dr. Borjajan knew better. She started quietly reaching out to hospitals, intensive care units, anywhere with the equipment and the ethical clearance to monitor human patients at the edge of death. It took years to gather the data. You can't just scan people's brains while they die. Ethics boards, family consent, the right equipment at the right moment. But by 2022, several research teams had collected enough cases to notice something that made the hair on their arms stand up. Patients who survived cardiac arrest and were successfully resuscitated showed the same neural surge Dr. Borjajan had seen in rats. But now they could ask the patients what they experienced. And what those patients described matched the brain scans with terrifying precision. A 57-year-old man in Boston, cardiac arrest during surgery, resuscitated after 4 minutes. Brain scan showed massive gamma wave surge 20 seconds after his heart stopped. When he woke up, he described the exact moment. He said everything became brilliantly clear, sharper than normal life. He saw the operating room from above, heard conversations, felt an overwhelming sense of clarity and peace. The timestamp of his description matched the gamma surge exactly. A 34-year-old woman in London, drowning victim, no heartbeat for 6 minutes. Her brain scan showed the same surge, same regions, same sequence. When she regained consciousness, she described the same hyper-awareness, the same sense of leaving her body, the same feeling that she was more awake than she'd ever been in her entire life. Case after case, the pattern held. Different countries, different causes of death. Different ages, genders, belief systems, it didn't matter. The brain activity was identical. And the experiences people reported matched that activity with unnerving consistency. By late 2023, neuroscientists stopped arguing about whether the pattern was real. It was real, repeatable, documented across independent studies. The argument shifted to something far more dangerous. What does it mean? Dr. Sam Parnia, a critical care physician at NYU who has spent decades studying resuscitation and consciousness, was one of the first to say out loud what others were thinking. This isn't the brain shutting down. This is the brain doing something we don't understand. Something that requires more energy, more coordination, more processing power than normal waking consciousness. If this is a hallucination, it's the most complex, organized, energy-intensive hallucination the brain is capable of producing, and it happens at the moment when the brain has the least resources available. That doesn't make sense unless something else is happening. What he didn't say publicly but told colleagues in private conversations was darker. The pattern suggests the brain is preparing for something: transition, upload, transfer. The terminology doesn't matter. What matters is that in the final moments before death, the human brain behaves as if it's launching a process, not ending one. Here's where it gets stranger. In December 2023, a research team in the Netherlands compared the brain scans of near-death patients with scans of people under the influence of DMT, a powerful psychedelic known for producing experiences nearly identical to near-death episodes. Out-of-body sensations, encounters with entities, a sense of moving through tunnels of light. The overlap was undeniable, but here's the catch. The brain produces DMT naturally. Synthesized in trace amounts in the pineal gland, and possibly released in larger quantities during extreme stress or death, which raises a question nobody wants to touch. Is the dying brain flooding itself with DMT to ease the transition? Or is it using DMT as a chemical key to unlock a door we don't normally have access to? Dr. Rick Strassman, the psychiatrist who conducted the first legal DMT studies in decades, was asked about the connection in a podcast interview. His answer was careful but chilling. If the brain is designed to release DMT at the moment of death, then death is not a malfunction, it's a feature. The brain has a protocol for this. That means whatever happens next, the brain expects it. Now pay attention because this is where the science crosses into something else entirely. In early 2024, a small group of neuroscientists, physicists, and consciousness researchers formed a private working group. No public announcements. No press releases, just secure communication and shared data. Their goal: figure out what the identical brain pattern means and whether it points to something beyond material neuroscience. One of the members, a physicist specializing in quantum biology, proposed something that made the rest of the group go silent. What if consciousness isn't produced by the brain? What if the brain is a receiver, a filter, a reducing valve that takes a much larger field of consciousness and narrows it down into the focused, limited awareness we call normal waking life? And what if, at the moment of death, that filter breaks and consciousness expands back into whatever it was before the brain constrained it? The idea isn't new. William James proposed it over a century ago, Aldous Huxley built on it. But this was the first time the idea had hard neuroscience behind it. The gamma surge, the hypercoherence, the identical patterns. All of it fit the model of a system not collapsing but opening. The group started calling it the expansion hypothesis. And while they won't publish it yet, won't risk their careers on something this controversial, they're quietly testing predictions. If consciousness expands at death, then the experiences people report should contain information they couldn't have accessed through normal perception. And that's exactly what they're finding. A patient in cardiac arrest described a conversation happening 3 rooms away while she was clinically dead. Staff confirmed the conversation occurred, word-for-word match. A man who drowned described seeing his daughter at home crying in a specific room wearing specific clothes. Time-stamped security footage confirmed it. He saw her at the exact moment his heart stopped, miles away with no possible sensory access. These aren't vague feelings, they're verifiable data points, and they're accumulating. Here's the deal: the scientific community is splitting. Publicly, most researchers still frame near-death experiences as hallucinations, oxygen deprivation, dying neurons misfiring. But privately, more and more are admitting the data doesn't fit that model. The experiences are too coherent, too consistent, too often verified by external facts the patient had no way of knowing. And the brain scans show a level of activity that shouldn't be possible if the brain is failing. Dr. Bruce Grayson, professor emeritus of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, has studied over 1,000 near-death cases. In a 2023 interview, he said something that made waves in quiet corners of the research world. We've been asking the wrong question. We keep asking, how does a dying brain produce these experiences? But maybe the question is, what is the brain preventing us from experiencing while we're alive? And what happens when that prevention stops? The implications are staggering. If the brain acts as a filter, then death isn't the end of consciousness. It's the end of the limits we experience as individual, separate selves. Consciousness doesn't vanish. It returns to something larger, something the brain, while alive, is specifically designed to keep us from perceiving because perceiving it fully would make normal human life impossible. Think about it. If you were constantly aware of everything, every perspective, every moment, every possibility, you couldn't function. You couldn't make decisions, form memories, maintain an identity. The brain's job isn't to create consciousness. It's to narrow it, focus it, make it usable for survival in a physical body. And when the body dies, the brain stops filtering. The walls come down, and consciousness expands back into whatever it actually is. This is the part that will stay with you. In March 2024, a patient in Germany was resuscitated after 11 minutes of cardiac arrest. By every medical standard, she should have had massive brain damage. No oxygen for that long causes irreversible harm. But when she woke up, she was cognitively intact, sharp, clear, no deficits, and she described an experience that matched the brain scans perfectly. She said she felt herself lift out of her body, but not into emptiness. Into connection. She described being aware of everyone in the hospital simultaneously. Patients, doctors, families, not hearing their thoughts exactly but feeling their emotions, their fears, their hopes as if they were her own. She described it as the most natural thing in the world, like remembering something she'd always known but had forgotten during life. And she said the hardest part of coming back wasn't the pain or the confusion, it was the loneliness. Being shoved back into one body, one perspective, one narrow slice of awareness after experiencing everything. The brain scans showed the gamma surge lasted 90 seconds. She described an experience that felt like hours. Time, space, identity, all of it collapsed into something that doesn't fit our normal framework. And she's not alone. Patients across the studies described the same thing. A a sense that normal life is the narrow, limited state and death is waking up. Now here's what neuroscientists won't say on the record but will admit in private. If this pattern holds, if every human brain does this at death, then we've been wrong about almost everything. Death isn't a tragedy, it's a process. Consciousness isn't fragile, it's foundational. And the dying brain isn't failing, it's completing a sequence it was always designed to complete. But there's a darker side. If the brain is a filter and death removes that filter, then what happens to people who die traumatically, violently unprepared? Do they experience the same expansion? Or does the shock, the fear, the sudden severance create a different outcome? Some researchers think the gamma surge is the brain's attempt to ease the transition, a neurological mercy protocol, flooding the system with chemicals and activity that create peace, clarity, acceptance. But what if that protocol fails? What if the system is damaged too quickly? There are cases, rare ones, where resuscitated patients describe the opposite of peace: confusion, terror, a sense of being trapped between states. The brain scans in those cases show fragmented patterns. The surge happens, but it's chaotic, disorganized, as if the process started but couldn't complete. Dr. Parnia's team is now investigating whether the way someone dies affects the neural pattern. Peaceful deaths, long declines, cases where the body shuts down gradually show the cleanest, most organized surges. Sudden deaths, trauma, violence show distorted patterns, which raises a horrifying question. Is there a right way to die, a way that allows the brain to complete its final task? And if so, what happens to those who don't get that chance? The research is ongoing, data is still being collected. But the scientists involved are starting to talk about end-of-life care differently. Not just managing pain, but protecting the brain's ability to complete the transition, reducing trauma, creating environments that allow the final neural surge to happen cleanly. It sounds like science fiction, but it's happening in ICUs right now. And here's the part nobody expected. Some patients who have been resuscitated and experienced the gamma surge report lasting changes. Not just psychological, neurological, enhanced intuition, sensitivity to others' emotions, a sense of connection that doesn't fade. Brain scans show persistent changes in connectivity. Regions that weren't communicating before are now linked, as if the near-death surge rewired something permanently. Dr. Grayson calls it the aftershock. The brain touched something during the surge, and even after resuscitation it can't fully forget. It remains partially open to whatever it accessed. These people describe living between worlds, still here, still functional, but aware of something beyond the normal bandwidth of perception. They're not psychic, they're not special, they just experienced a process the rest of us will only go through once, and they came back changed. The scientific papers are starting to appear, cautious, hedged with qualifiers, but the data is there. Identical brain patterns across cultures, across causes of death, across belief systems. The brain does something at the moment of death that it never does at any other time. Something coordinated, purposeful, intense, and the people who survive it describe experiences that suggest consciousness continues, expands, transforms. Neuroscientists have stopped arguing about whether it happens. Now they're arguing about what it means, and the truth is nobody knows, not yet, but the data points in a direction most of science isn't ready to follow. That consciousness is not a product of the brain, that death is not an ending, that the final surge is the brain's last act, not of desperation but of release. Somewhere in a research lab right now, someone is looking at a brain scan of a patient who just died. They're watching the gamma waves surge, they're marking the timing, the regions, the sequence, and they're wondering the same thing you're wondering right now. What is the brain doing in those final seconds? What is it experiencing? Where is it going? The answer is in the data. Repeatable, consistent, undeniable. But the meaning, the implications, the truth of what happens when we die, that's still beyond the edge of what science can fully grasp. For now, all we know is this. The brain has a plan, and when the moment comes, it executes that plan with more precision, more power, more purpose than anything it does while we're alive. Death is not the end of awareness, it's the beginning of something else. And every brain that has ever died has followed the same pattern, the same surge, the same final brilliant light. We thought death was darkness. The scans show the opposite. In the final moments, the brain doesn't go dark, it becomes more awake than it has ever been, and what it wakes up to is something we're only beginning to understand. But here's what makes this moment in time so critical. We're not just observing a phenomenon anymore. We're approaching a threshold where the evidence will become too substantial to ignore. Within the next few years, as more research teams collaborate and more data accumulates, the scientific consensus will face a choice. Either acknowledge that everything we've built our understanding of consciousness on is incomplete, or continue to dismiss patterns that are increasingly impossible to explain away. The resistance we're seeing isn't really about the science. It's about what accepting this means for how we live, how we die, and what we believe about the nature of existence itself. Think about the cascading implications. If consciousness isn't produced by the brain but merely filtered through it, then every person who has ever lived has carried within them something infinite, something that continues beyond the body. Every human being, That changes philosophy, theology, medicine, psychology, everything. It means the fear of death, which has driven so much of human behavior, might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding. We're not afraid of ceasing to exist. We're afraid of transformation we can't control. We're afraid of the unknown. But what if we had proof that the unknown isn't annihilation? What if we had proof that it's reunion, expansion, liberation? How would that change the way we treat each other? How would it change the way we treat ourselves? The research team in Sweden is now looking at whether meditation, prayer, or certain states of consciousness can partially replicate the gamma surge pattern while people are still alive. Early results suggest they can, not completely, not with the same intensity, but certain meditative states show signatures that echo the death pattern, which implies something profound. The dying brain might not be doing something entirely foreign. It might be activating a process that already exists within us, something we can potentially touch while we're still living. Some spiritual traditions have been describing exactly this for thousands of years. The dissolution of self, the expansion into unity consciousness, the return to source. What were they describing if not the gamma surge? What were they accessing if not the transformation the dying brain naturally undergoes? We're standing at a point where ancient wisdom and cutting-edge neuroscience are pointing at the same truth from different directions. And that convergence, that alignment, is what will eventually break through the resistance. Science can dismiss philosophy. It can dismiss theology, but it can't dismiss its own data forever. Not when the data keeps repeating, keeps validating, keeps showing the same pattern across every human population we test. The pattern is real. The transformation is real. The expansion is real, and eventually, inevitably, we'll have to accept that consciousness doesn't die, it changes form. Some researchers are already starting to ask the harder questions. If consciousness expands at death, does it expand into something that already exists? Is there a larger field of consciousness that individual brains are temporarily separated from? And if so, what does that larger consciousness contain? Is it aware of us while we're alive? Does it remember us after we die? The questions sound metaphysical, but they're being asked by physicists and neuroscientists with impeccable credentials in locked rooms with encrypted communications. Because they know what's coming. They know that once this data becomes undeniable, these questions will no longer be fringe. They'll be central. And the institutions that have built themselves on the materialist assumption that consciousness is produced by matter will have to fundamentally reconstruct their entire framework. This is why some of the most senior researchers are remaining silent publicly while working frantically behind the scenes. They understand that what we're documenting isn't just a new finding about the brain. It's a paradigm shift of the magnitude that happens maybe once every few centuries in science. Copernicus moving the Earth from the center of the universe, Darwin reframing the origin of life, Einstein showing that time and space aren't absolute, and now this, the discovery that consciousness is not a property of matter but something that matter temporarily contains. The implications are staggering enough that the scientific community is moving cautiously, deliberately, gathering evidence until the case is airtight. And that moment is approaching faster than anyone expected. The data from 2024 is stronger than the data from 2023. The data this month is stronger than the data last month. The pattern holds, the consistency deepens, the verification increases, and with each new case, each new confirmation, the resistance weakens. More researchers are willing to go on record. More institutions are funding the work. More journals are publishing the findings. The dam is going to break, not all at once, but the cracks are spreading. And when it finally does break, when the broader scientific community has to acknowledge what the data has been saying all along, it will trigger a fundamental shift in how humanity understands itself. Because here's what people haven't fully grasped yet. This isn't just about death. Once we accept that consciousness isn't produced by the brain, we have to reconsider everything. Memory, emotion, identity, intuition, purpose. We have to ask which of these are actually produced by the brain and which are simply accessed by it. We have to consider that the brain might be more like a radio receiver than a factory. And if that's true, then consciousness isn't isolated in skulls. It's distributed, connected, potentially communicative across the boundaries we thought were absolute. The implications ripple outward into neurology, into quantum physics, into the very nature of reality. And this is exactly why the resistance has been so strong. Because accepting this truth would require rebuilding not just neuroscience but the entire edifice of modern materialism. It's not a small thing, it's everything. But resistance to truth has a short shelf life. The data will win eventually, it always does. And when it does, when humanity finally accepts that we are not isolated consciousnesses trapped in dying bodies, but rather aspects of something larger that temporarily experiences itself through individual human lives, the reverberations will be profound. We'll approach medicine differently. We'll approach death differently. We'll approach each other differently. Because if consciousness is fundamental and continues, then hurting another person isn't just an ethical wrong. It's literally harming an extension of the same consciousness you yourself are an extension of. Every interaction becomes sacred. Every moment becomes weighted with significance. Every person becomes recognizable as yourself experiencing itself from a different angle. The research will continue, the data will accumulate, the resistance will gradually transform into acceptance. And somewhere in your future, in the moment when your own brain executes that final surge, when the filter dissolves and the walls come down, you'll understand with perfect clarity what all of this was pointing toward. You'll experience directly what these neuroscientists are documenting indirectly. You'll become the data, you'll complete the pattern. And in that moment, all the fear, all the uncertainty, all the desperate searching for answers will resolve into something beyond words, because you'll finally understand what you actually are. Not a body, not a brain, not an isolated consciousness trapped in matter, but rather awareness itself, temporarily experiencing limitation, about to remember its true nature. And that transformation, that return, that expansion into what you actually are, has been the point all along. Every living moment is a preparation for it. Every experience is an education toward it. And when the moment comes, your brain will know exactly what to do.